All right, ready to dive in.
Always.
Hey, well, today we're diving deep into the ocean, that is.
Sounds refreshing.
It is, in a way, but also a little troubling when you look at what's going on down there.
Definitely a lot to unpack.
We're focusing on Chapter 9 of the research, all about ocean health, the threats they're facing, and how we can, use ocean resources without completely messing things up.
The classic, can we have our cake and eat it too dilemma.
Exactly. And with oceans, the stakes are pretty high.
Absolutely. I think it's easy to forget just how crucial oceans are to, well, everything.
Yeah, we tend to think of them as just big, pretty bodies of water.
Right. But it's so much more than that. They regulate our climate, for one.
Okay.
They absorb a huge amount of the CO2 we're pumping out, and they support all these intricate food webs that we rely on for, seafood and all that.
So not just a scenic backdrop then. One thing that really hit me in the research was the sheer scale of that CO2 absorption.
Yeah, it's mind-boggling. The ocean's like this giant carbon sink.
But it sounds like our actions are kind of messing with that ability.
That's right. The research goes into ocean acidification, which is directly tied to rising CO2 levels.
Okay, so more CO2, more acidic water. But what does that actually mean for the ocean?
Well, the more CO2 the ocean absorbs, the more acidic the water gets. And that makes it really hard for certain creatures to survive.
Creatures? Like what kind?
Think about things that need to build shells. Oysters, corals, even tiny plankton. They need calcium carbonate to build their skeletons, and a more acidic environment makes that process way harder.
So it's like trying to build a house out of dissolving bricks.
Exactly. Not a recipe for success.
Makes sense. And of course, we can't talk about ocean problems without mentioning the big one, plastic pollution.
Right. The research doesn't sugarcoat it. It's a serious problem.
It's everywhere, right?
Pretty much. We're talking about over 8 million tons of plastic entering the ocean every year.
Whoa.
And it's not just an eyesore. It breaks down into these tiny microplastics.
Microplastics, yeah.
That basically permeate the entire food chain. They're finding these things in fish, shellfish, even sea salt.
Okay, that's a little too close to home for comfort. So we're dumping plastic in, making the water more acidic. Anything else we should add to this cocktail of ocean troubles?
Sadly, yeah, there's more. The research lists a bunch of other pollutants. Chemicals, industrial waste, agricultural runoff. Nutrient pollution is a particularly big one.
Nutrient pollution? What's that?
It's basically excess nutrients, mostly from fertilizers and sewage that end up in the ocean. And they trigger these massive algal blooms.
I've heard of those.
They're bad news. When the blooms die and decompose, they use up all the oxygen in the water.
So?
Yeah, it creates these areas called dead zones where most marine life can't survive.
So basically suffocating whole ecosystems.
Pretty much.
It's a grim picture, for sure. All this pollution disrupting the balance makes you wonder if sustainable fishing is even, possible.
Yeah, it's a tough one, especially with the demand for seafood always going up.
Right. Can we actually fish sustainably without, wiping out entire populations?
Well, the research definitely points to overfishing as a huge problem. We're taking fish out faster than they can, reproduce and replenish.
Makes sense. So are we just doomed then?
Not necessarily. There are some glimmers of hope. The research mentions Iceland. They've got this system called individual transferable quotas that seems to be working pretty well.
Individual transferable.
Yeah.
Individual transferable quotas. Basically, each fishing vessel gets a certain share of the total allowable catch.
Okay, so like a limit on how much they can fish.
Exactly. And the cool part is these shares can be bought, sold, or traded.
Interesting.
It creates this economic incentive for fishermen to manage their catch responsibly.
So it's kind of like putting a price tag on sustainability.
Yeah, you could say that. It's a market-based approach to conservation, I guess.
Huh. Well, if it works, it works. What about aquaculture? That's got to be a more sustainable option, right? Just farm fish instead of catching them. Aquaculture definitely has potential, yeah. It could really help with meeting global food demand, especially as the population grows.
But I know there's some downsides too, right? Like environmental impacts and stuff.
There are definitely concerns. It's not just a matter of throwing some fish in a tank and calling it a day. You need careful planning and responsible practices to make sure you're not doing more harm than good.
Okay, so what kind of harm are we talking about?
Well, for one, pollution. Fish farms can generate a lot of waste.
Yeah, I can imagine.
If that waste isn't managed properly, it can pollute the surrounding waters pretty badly. And then there's the issue of habitat damage.
Habitat damage.
Yeah. Some types of aquaculture, like shrimp farming, can lead to things like mangrove deforestation and, the destruction of these really important coastal ecosystems.
So are there ways to do aquaculture more sustainably?
Definitely. The research talks about a lot of really interesting innovations, things like closed containment systems, for instance.
Closed containment.
Yeah, these are systems that kind of minimize waste and prevent fish from escaping. And then there's this really cool idea of integrating seaweed farming.
Seaweed farming. How does that help?
Seaweed's great at absorbing excess nutrients, so it can help mitigate the pollution problem. And there's a growing movement towards farming species lower on the food chain.
Lower on the food chain.
Like mussels and oysters. They require fewer resources and have a smaller environmental footprint compared to, something like salmon.
So it's like choosing your fish wisely, even when they're farmed.
Exactly. It all comes down to making smart choices, whether it's fishing or aquaculture, moving away from business as usual and embracing innovation and responsibility.
Okay, I'm sensing a theme here.
Right. It's about recognizing that the ocean isn't just this, endless resource we can exploit. We need to coexist with it.
Yeah, we're part of the ecosystem, not just plunderers.
Well said. We need to shift our mindset from conquering to protecting and preserving.
It's a lot to think about, that's for sure. But it sounds like there's at least some reason for optimism, right? What gives you hope for the future of the oceans?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, for one thing, there's a lot more awareness these days. People are starting to understand the problems and they're concerned.
That's a good sign.
Yeah. It's driving demand for sustainable products and putting pressure on businesses to clean up their act.
So it's like people are starting to vote with their wallets.
Exactly. Consumer power. But it's not just individuals, of course. There's also a lot happening on the policy and governance side of things.
Oh, good. What kind of stuff?
Well, the research talks about a bunch of international agreements and initiatives aimed at protecting the ocean.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
There's this big push to establish marine protected areas, kind of like national parks for the ocean.
Makes sense. So no fishing or drilling or any of that stuff in those areas.
Right. The idea is to give those ecosystems a chance to breathe and recover. But of course, these are global issues, right?
Yeah, you're going to need a lot of countries to get on board for any of that to work.
Definitely. It takes international cooperation, which can be, it can be tricky sometimes.
Okay.
But there are some promising examples of collaboration.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
For example, several countries are working together to try to combat illegal fishing and reduce plastic pollution, too.
That's awesome. So maybe there's hope for like some kind of ocean diplomacy.
Yeah.
Where countries put aside their differences and work together to protect this shared resource.
It would be amazing, wouldn't it? I mean, at the end of the day, the fate of our oceans depends on all of us, from individuals to governments and everything in between.
So it's not just about scientists and policymakers then?
No way. Every choice we make has an impact. The seafood we eat, the products we buy, it all adds up.
Wow. Kind of overwhelming, but also empowering in a way. Like we can actually make a difference.
Exactly. We all have a role to play in ensuring a healthy future for our oceans. It's about recognizing that we're not just visitors on this planet. We're part of this incredible interconnected web of life, and the choices we make today will determine what that web looks like tomorrow.
Well, that's a pretty profound thought to leave us with. I think that about wraps up our deep dive into the world of oceans. We've seen the challenges, the solutions, and the fact that we all have a part to play in protecting this incredible resource. Thanks for joining us.